Hello, welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us for this exciting panel, Trained for Deception, How Artificial Intelligence Fuels Online Disinformation. My name is Rishi Barwani. I'm the Director of Partnerships and Policy at Accountable Tech, and I'll be moderating this conversation and facilitating the conversation among our fantastic experts who will introduce themselves right now. I'll kick it over to Spandi Singh at the Open Technology Institute.
Thanks, Rishi. Hi, everyone. My name is Spandi, and I'm a policy analyst at New America's Open Technology Institute, and I lead our work around content moderation, algorithmic accountability, and transparency reporting. Over the past 2 years, internet platforms have radically changed the policies and practices they deploy to tackle misinformation and disinformation. Many platforms have especially begun relying on AI and ML-based tools to curate and moderate the content we see online. And while the use of AI and ML for addressing misleading information is not new, we've seen that companies have been using these kinds of curation techniques like labeling, downranking, and so on to combat misleading content. And many of these companies tout the use of these techniques as effective, but they have provided very little transparency around the policies that guide the use of these approaches and the impact of their use. And as the landscape memo that all of us put together a few weeks ago outlines, misinformation and disinformation is a rapidly expanding problem in the online sphere, and AI and ML-based tools can worsen the issue at hand. And while it's great to see that companies are trying to tackle the issue head on, we need more transparency in order to promote and generate greater accountability.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Spandi. Now I'll kick it over to Lauren Kraft from the Anti-Defamation League.
Thanks so much, Rishi. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Lauren Kropf, Counsel for Technology Policy and Advocacy at the Anti-Defamation League. ADL knows that fighting hate in all forms includes fighting online disinformation. The way news and current events reverberate online matters, and the concern around social media's role hosting and even promoting hate, racism, extremism, harassment, and disinformation is well-founded. False allegations of voter fraud spread online led to the violent insurrection at our nation's capital. The most predictable terror attack in American history was motivated by hate and disinformation on social media. Online harassment is also rampant. According to ADL's latest data, 41% of Americans have experienced online harassment, and 1 in 3 of those harassed attribute at least some of it to their identity. This hate isn't only taking place on fringe message boards. 75% of those harassed said at least some harassment happened on Facebook, 24% on Twitter, 21% on YouTube, 50% on Snapchat. Well-resourced, highly profitable platforms. Despite these alarming concerns, efforts by social media companies to manage hate and disinformation have been inadequate at best, but also opaque, arbitrary, biased, and inequitable. Most major platforms publish transparency reports, but in reality, share limited information. Today, it is nearly impossible to know the full scope and nature of extremism and hate online, which is often motivated by amplified disinformation and harmful conspiracy theories. I look forward to our conversation today on this important topic.
Thank you so much, Lauren. Kick it over now to Dominique Harrison from the Joint Center.
Hi there. So as Rishi said, I'm Dr. Dominique Harrison, and I'm Director of Tech Policy Program at the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies. I'm very happy to be here to discuss these important issues. A little history about the Joint Center. So the Joint Center was founded in 1970, which is about 50 years ago, and we were created to support newly elected Black officials who were moving from civil rights activism into governance. The Joint Center quickly became America's Black think tank. It became the policy hub for government officials and public intellectuals concerned about the future of African American communities. Today, we explore staff diversity on the Hill, the challenges and opportunities of the changing nature of work for Black communities, economic policy and the status of Black communities, and lastly, tech policy. So our tech policy program is dedicated to exploring the impact of emerging technologies and developing policy solutions to improve the lives of Black communities. And we are focused on 3 program pillars. The first is platform accountability, We evaluate and develop legislative strategies to prevent misinformation and disinformation, voter suppression, discriminatory practices, and other content that harm Black communities. Broadband access and adoption. We advocate and advance policies and programs that enable Black communities to access affordable high-speed internet. And lastly, privacy and algorithmic fairness. And that is where we explore the critical kind of privacy issues and big data practices that produce discriminatory outcomes for Black communities. So I'm happy to talk about some of these topics and to go in detail later on in this program.
Thank you so much, Dominique. And last but certainly not least, we have Odanga Madung from the Mozilla Foundation.
Hey, Rishi. And sorry, it's Madung. I think I need to at least place some emphasis there. So my name is Odanga Madung, and I am a Tech and Society Fellow and journalist based at the Mozilla Foundation, where my work essentially is to research and cover the unpredictable collision between African societies and big tech companies. And since I joined Mozilla for over about a year now, I have basically been focusing on the effects of the neglect that big tech, or rather big American-based technology companies, and the kind of neglect, the effects of the kind of neglect on that their platforms, or rather, the effects of the neglect of the impact of their platforms on African societies. And in that point, I've seen how they've ended up getting banned for failing to moderate appropriately on content within jurisdictions such as Uganda. I've looked at how they have effectively sort of stifled vaccine rollout programs within the continent due to the misinformation and disinformation that has been spread on their platforms. And of course, as of recently, I also covered how, or rather, a lot of these platforms were also being used to target journalists and civil society activists and stifle free speech, as we in Kenya were actually undergoing a constitutional review process. So I'm hoping to bring that perspective to the table as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Odanga. So let's kick off the panel now. And Dominique, I want to start with you, because technology for a long time has been described as the great equalizer. Technology permeates every aspect of our lives, and yet it doesn't feel like things have gotten a whole lot more equal yet. Is that because technology needs more time to develop, or do we need to reevaluate the accuracy of that description?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And I don't think I've ever kind of really bought into that kind of thinking in terms of technology being the great equalizer. I mean, technology in the way that we view it at the Joint Center, and the issues that surround it have to do with those who have access to it and those who are harmed by its use. And usually what happens is those who are harmed by its use or who have access to it is replicated by the kind of historical and contemporary behaviors or practices that you see today, which includes bias and discrimination, right? And so as we continue to innovate and drive the use of emerging technologies, we need to keep in mind that technology is ultimately subject to human bias and can be built into new systems. So in many ways, while there is intention that technology be an equalizer for all communities, what we've seen in the past and continue to see today, that it is not that way.
Yeah, I think a lot of folks are recognizing that that is the reality. And, it feels like issues relating to civil rights has been a problem for a very long time. HUD, the Agency of Housing and Urban Development, first filed a complaint against Facebook more than 3 years ago. And we already have civil rights laws on the books. Why aren't those civil rights laws being applied to these tech giants?
Yeah, so we're actually working on some research on these issues. In March, we actually convened researchers, policymakers, data scientists, and other key stakeholders for a private virtual roundtable to identify the kind of harmful impacts of artificial intelligence and big data technologies on Black people. and to chart a path toward the most effective ways to protect, like, the privacy interests or data of Black communities. And what we learn is that many people may not know if they are being discriminated against, because you would need to have the data to understand that there's some type of algorithmic discrimination occurring. We also learned that policymakers are looking at ways to address these problems, only to find that they lack both the tools and the technical expertise to regulate wisely, meaningfully, and efficiently. So one tool to combat these harms is to use, as you said, Rishi, existing anti-discrimination laws to hold companies accountable for the use of personal data that result in discriminatory outcomes in employment, housing, credit, and lending. And we're looking at these industries because they are governed by federal agencies that can enforce anti-discrimination laws. However, though, the ambiguity of data-driven technologies makes it a hard task to identify biases or discrimination of algorithms, because it is mathematically hard to know what an algorithm will do until it is used in practice. And discrimination may result from the use of algorithms unintentionally. And unintentional discrimination is called disparate impact. And that's a legal doctrine that we have in our toolbox to use against these kind of harms. But on the other hand, advances in technological innovation have made it hard for people to discover and assess this type of discrimination that occurs. So the problem here is that the ways that anti-discrimination law has been applied in the past are not well suited to address the data-driven nature of algorithmic discrimination today. But policies, solutions like rulemaking, administrative enforcement mechanism, and affirmative legislation can be used to prevent companies from data discrimination. And these are just some of the things that we're looking at and try to address these issues, especially as we think of disinformation and misinformation.
Got it. That's so helpful, and thanks for laying that out there. I do have one additional question to follow up. I mean, you talked about some of the legislative proposals that are being considered, and that agencies like the FTC could take action. But these regulatory gaps, can they be filled alone with policy interventions, or would we be better off creating a new regulatory agency to apply and enforce civil rights protections to online platforms explicitly?
That's a great question. I think the nuance here is that because that we see this kind of data-driven discrimination occurring across various kind of aspects of our lives, and when I say that, I mean the different industries like housing, employment, and lending, sometimes it may be best for those agencies who have the expertise and experience in addressing issues as it relates to discrimination in housing, employment, or lending to perhaps take on that kind of rulemaking or applying those kind of anti-discrimination laws to those specific cases, right? As opposed to a new agency taking on data discrimination in housing, employment, and lending. And so I think in general, some ways of addressing this issue is by having federal privacy legislation, but I do think there needs to be more work within the federal government to address these harms and to share information and best practices across the field, right, in order to understand where this discrimination is occurring, how it's occurring, and the kinds of things that the tools and laws that we have in our toolbox that we can use to address them. Awesome.
That's so helpful, Dominique. Thank you. I want to move over to Lauren now from the Anti-Defamation League. And I want to put this question to you because I think most people recognize the ubiquity of mis and disinformation and the rise in hate-based violence and extremism, but you describe these two trends as related. Could you tell us a little bit more about why you see it that way?
Absolutely. Thanks, Rishi. I think that it's really important to draw the connection between mis and disinformation and hate and harassment and violence and extremism, because it is drawn, that connection is drawn together sometimes, but not often enough. A lot of mis and disinformation is fueled by viral conspiracy theories. And a lot of conspiracy theories at their core are rooted in hate and racism, anti-Semitism, extremism, and other, anti-democratic ideals, so on and so forth. What we see is that this spread of this type of information online fuels not only a massive belief in some sort of conspiracy theory, some sort of unfounded ideas, but also then the direct connection to both online and offline violence forms. And a couple of short examples would be In 2018, the mass murder shooting in the synagogue in Squirrel Hill, Pittsburgh. 2019, the shooting in El Paso at the Walmart in El Paso. These shootings, we know from manifestos and from other information that there are roots of white supremacy and extremism that are fueling these. But I really want to focus on one particular example, which is the hate and violence against the AAPI community we saw over the last year. ADL's data showed that online hate and harassment targeting the AAPI community, this was the largest single rise in severe online harassment year over year in comparison to other identity groups. Then we also saw that hate and violence on the ground, whether it was the shooting in Atlanta or other hate crimes across the country. I think it's no coincidence that this follows a year where the AAPI community experienced hate, but also they were the brunt of harmful conspiracy theories and mis and disinformation regarding the coronavirus. So you see that connection through and through. And just lastly, of course, we can't overlook the insurrection at our Capitol, which I mentioned earlier, fueled by the big lie that our election was stolen. Again, mis and disinformation, then directly correlated to online violence. So I definitely think the through line is there is pretty clear. And we see, unfortunately, time and time again, targeting different communities or different pieces to our democratic process.
Yeah, thanks so much for pulling that out, because I think it's such an important point that sometimes gets lost when we're looking at these issues through a policy lens. These problems that happen online, they lead to real offline violence, and you named some of the big examples there. But I want to ask you then, what was the response from these platforms when these horrific incidents happened? Did they make changes to their product or algorithm to ensure that history doesn't repeat itself?
I wish that were the case. Well, what I will say is there was definitely some sort of acknowledgement or strengthening in some policies from the platforms regarding mis and disinformation, especially related to Holocaust denial or conspiracy theories like QAnon, or policies that they may have to protect communities. But we know that policy strengthening enforcement, at scale. It seems like I might have frozen. Am I back? Okay, so I'll just back up for a second and say, a policy is only as good as its enforcement. And we've seen is a lack of enforcement at scale, so that platforms might say that they're strengthening their policies, but we're not actually seeing from algorithmic amplification or from victims and targets that they are seeing that on the user end, because again, a policy is only lip service if it's not being robustly and equitably enforced. Yeah,
and it's sobering, but I think it correctly characterizes the urgency behind our work and the conversation we're having today. I have a pretty direct question here, because this has been in the news quite a bit over the course of the past few weeks. For folks who haven't seen, Facebook is in a tight spot right now, especially in the wake of documents revealed by a whistleblower who showed tremendous courage over the course of the past few weeks. And Lauren, I just want to ask, is it true that platforms like Facebook are actually profiting off of this dangerous mis and disinformation? And could you describe to us how that works?
Absolutely. And I'm glad you brought up the courageous whistleblower, because we were able to see numbers and clear facts and internal vocabulary behind what we had already known quite well, which is that the business model behind major tech platforms is ultimately an engagement business model. And so the idea is to serve up the most engaging content for individuals to stay on platforms for as long as possible. So these platforms can serve as many advertisements as possible and as well targeted as possible to individual users. Now, what we know is what gets the most engagement: inflammatory, corrosive, and hateful content. And so that is what ends up being what's served up most frequently. And then algorithms recognize this as popular and engaging content, and then continue to surface it and serve it up and recommend it to individuals. So that cycle of making more money from serving up advertisements, which, by the way, comes from also collecting copious amounts of data from users to serve direct and targeted ads, and then serving the content that matches that to keep people shocked and in awe as long as possible. That's there. And what we learned from the whistleblower was that even from Facebook's case, at least particularly, if there was even a 1% off in engagement or a 0.1% off in user sessions, then the platform would not be willing to tweak their algorithms to guard against this type of misinformation or hateful or corrosive content. So unfortunately, Rishi, yes, they are profiting off of hate and disinformation.
And I think that's the connection. Most of us may have heard this analog here between big tech being the new big tobacco, and that right there, I think, is what they do have in common. That big tech is totally aware of how harmful their product is, and yet they're hawking it to kids. They're hiding their research, and they're doing everything they can to make an extra dollar. And that's where the similarities, what they have in common. What they don't have in common, in my view, is the scale of societal harms and what big tech has perpetrated over the course of the past several years, from undermining our 2016 election to undermining our efforts to get every American vaccinated. Big tech is in many ways stealing big tobacco's playbook, but the scale and reach and scope of those harms actually far outpace those of big tobacco. And so thank you for sort of pulling that out and identifying the ways in which they have in common. Odeng, I want to move to you now, because these problems that we're wrestling with here in the United States are not unique to those of us here in the United States. They affect communities around the world. And you recently have done a lot of work evaluating these systems and the impact of mis and disinformation in Kenya. Could you tell us a little bit about that work that you've been doing?
Yes, absolutely. So I think over about like 3 months ago, I did some research with a colleague of mine called Brian Obilo around how Twitter specifically was being weaponized against civil society activists, or rather activists in civil society, journalists, and specifically our judiciary, after they carried out a ruling against our sitting president and the government on a constitutional review, on a very, what I would say is a very archaic constitutional review process that nobody in the country asked for or was supporting. Now, very many people who stood up against this process suddenly found that whenever they would post anything online, they would have a whole bunch of people come and sit in their mentions, basically, trying to trash their opinions. And every single day there was a hashtag attacking either the judiciary, a journalist who may have done a story that held the government to account, or a civil society activist who maybe spoke up against the government at the time. So looking at this, we had already had an idea that, the government here in Kenya had been trying to tarnish the image of civil society for quite some time. And we were aware that the big tech platforms, specifically Facebook and Twitter, were a key conduit by which they would actually try to do that. And so this constitutional review process gave us the perfect recipe to bring all of these elements together and try to understand, what exactly is the kind of effect that these kind of campaigns have in our ecosystem. What role do the platforms have to play? And, what kind of neglect is actually going on? Because this is going to be a very big theme, I think, as I talk about my own experience in this whole sector. This is definitely going to be a very big theme for me. And, one of the things we actually also went ahead to do was to try and infiltrate the operation that was being carried out against civil society activists and our judiciary. And I think the biggest finding that we got was that disinformation is an industry. It's an industry with a demand, and it's an industry with very willing suppliers. And the tech platforms are the willing conduits of how this industry is carried out, right? So if you are to think about like the same way a bank will launder money for criminals, between criminals, or facilitate payments or facilitate illegal payments, the tech platforms are that, right? They're essentially the same people that actually go ahead and facilitate this exchange to go on. And so, knowing that, we were able to actually get, a very inside perspective as to how they organize. how they, and I think one of the biggest findings we found was that how WhatsApp is a big command center for how a lot of these campaigns are organized. And we managed to actually obtain screenshots showing, the kind of instructions they were given, who they were told to attack, the kind of things that they were gonna do. And we are also still continuing with this research, and it's just beginning to dawn on us on how big this industry is in Kenya, right? When you think about an industry, sometimes you'll find that there are case studies of people who have been successful in this industry. Well, we found out that the disinformation industry has the same thing. When we were talking to the influencers that were doing these operations, they'll talk about, how, I know this guy, when he started out, he was very skinny. And if you know Africans, a sign of wealth is when you become a bit bigger and, a bit rounder on the cheeks. And, now they're like, this guy's now, he's gotten so much money. He's bought himself a car. He even got married recently. He's a bit rounder on the cheeks. And so, it's beginning to dawn on me that there was a lot of money to be made, and that we are only beginning to scratch the surface as to what these kind of operations look like in Kenya. And, the platforms have been very neglectful as to how their features are being weaponized here in this specific corner of the world. And one of the questions, we tried to ask Twitter was, why aren't you paying as much attention as you would pay in the US to, this kind of thing? And secondly, why are you making money off of it? Because specifically on Twitter, the trending algorithm was constantly being weaponized, right? So these guys would try to sort of manufacture trends that would end up on the trending section, okay? But unfortunately, what we would see is in the trends that contained a lot of hate speech, we also noticed that Twitter was placing ads in between each and every single one of those trends. And essentially, I think they did make quite a bit significant money off of that, right? And we saw civil society activists effectively even go off the platform because they could not withstand the kind of vitriol that was coming towards them. Of course, Kenyans did triumph over all of this. We did shoot down the constitutional amendment process, and which was a big boot to the face of the government. And I think a stark revelation to Twitter as well as to the kind of things that their platform is being used for in corners of the world that perhaps they do not want to pay attention to. And so, yes, that is essentially what our research contained.
Super, super helpful. And I worry that if I went to Kenya, people would incorrectly assume that I was far more wealthy than I actually am. So I learned something new today. This isn't the first time we've learned about coordinated bad actors weaponizing social media to sow civil unrest. Of course, a notable example here in the 2016 presidential election, and of course, more recently in January of 2020. Odenga, you name-checked Facebook's WhatsApp and Twitter. And I just want to ask, have the platforms done anything since you've produced this research to protect us against these types of influence campaigns?
Yeah, okay. The best they could do is, so far from what they have told us, because that also this presents a very interesting problem, because on one hand we need them to be open, right? But on the other hand, they can't be too open because they don't want the bad actors to be observing what they're doing and then adapting to that, which I found to be a very interesting response that came from them. But they did suspend a certain number of accounts, right? Based off of the networks that we identified, which I think I felt like it was, how would I call it? It was cosmetic, right? It was very much just, I felt like a cosmetic approach, and it's not the best that they could do. They definitely need to sort of take care of their trending section, specifically Twitter, because that is being weaponized on a crazy scale, not just in Kenya, but across the entire continent. When we release the research, you'd find people from Tanzania saying, this is happening here too. People from Zimbabwe, this is happening here too. Uganda, same thing. And Twitter got banned in Uganda after creating a system that allowed the Ugandan government to weaponize it. Then Twitter went ahead and took action on those accounts, which included government accounts. And then the Ugandan government banned Twitter for 3 months. If the neglect was not there in the first place, Twitter would not have been banned. If they were taking care of their platform in the first place, they wouldn't have been banned, but now they ended up playing victim. So, there has been some progress, but, banning accounts is not the only way to do it. It's a very cosmetic approach. And, of course, as we talk about the Facebook files, there's the big question of whether any real systemic changes that can actually allow these platforms to be healthy is going to affect the massive profits that these guys make, right? And so, you do wonder whether what I would like to call this form of colonial extraction, whether it's going to have any significant changes anytime soon, given that these guys have a direct incentive not to actually make any significant changes.
Yep. Before I give you a last question here, I just want to let the audience know that we're going to be taking questions from the audience in 10 minutes. So please start brainstorming and dropping them in the chat. And then Odenga, I have this one final question for you, which is what role should AI and machine learning play in catching these types of coordinated influence networks, understanding the platforms have a financial incentive not to do it themselves, and how could an over-reliance on AI and machine learning cause things to be missed?
Okay, so maybe I can throw one question back at you, which is, how would an AI spot if someone was renting his verified account for a disinformation campaign?
I'm no AI expert here, but I could imagine picking up on new patterns or different types of behavior.
Yeah.
I imagine it could be one way.
Yeah, because I think that was the big thing that we found, that, I do wonder how proficient, and that's the big challenge, right? How proficient would AI be at trying to identify massively coordinated, offline coordinated campaigns? Because one of the things we saw, and I think a big finding for us, was that we found a whole bunch of people with verified accounts that were essentially renting them out for use in disinformation campaigns, right? And then secondly, tech bros like to talk so much about like the power of AI and all this kind of stuff. But, I found guys, right now I'm working on some more additional work, and, we found guys who said they've been doing this thing since 2015, right? So if these guys say they've been taking action and that AI is going to save us all, I'm like, this guy's been doing this work for 7 years and no AI has caught him. He's managed to run several campaigns. He's made a lot of money, right? And so I do wonder how the kind of struggle that we're going to have around this, because we did put Twitter to a very solid challenge. Like, look, here are these accounts. This is how they're breaking the law, right? These things are clearly coordinated campaigns. Why is this guy only tweeting about one hashtag for 3 days, right? But they said, no, we can't take them down. We can't take action on these types of campaigns, right? So it's also about action from these platforms. And it's also about, really going very hard and, really investigating these information operations. And them also taking action and not just leaving it to AI. There are many times they really just need to put their foot down, but they fail to do it. So that's it for me.
I wanted to just add something here, because the fact of the matter is that these big tech companies are worth trillions of dollars, and they have a number of resources. They employ many people, and they want to be global companies. And the fact of the matter is they need to figure it out. They can employ massive teams of people to be dedicated to some of these issues across the world for specific countries, right? The profits that they make let us know that they have power, right, to at least try to make some actions as it relates to some of these issues. So, as Odenga was asking, how would they figure out, or, if some of these kinds of bad actors are doing these campaigns, it's like they need to be putting in that effort and work into doing that, or employing more researchers who have the kind of expertise and knowledge on these topics to help them, address these outcomes. But at the end of the day, I think that all of this, the onus needs to be on them. They have the power, they have the money, they have the resources, and they need to be employing more people to address these issues, especially as they continue to expand across the world. You need to, just in as much as they are trying to follow the laws of different countries and continents, they need to be paying just as much attention as it relates to the harmful effects of their technologies on the people and the communities, because we see the real ramifications of what this means for the lives of real people. And so I just really wanted to emphasize that point, because, they're rich, right? And so they have to have some power that they use for good.
Dominic, I'm so glad you mentioned that. I just wanted to quickly pop in and emphasize that, but also underscore what we knew, but again, relearn this week from the Facebook whistleblower, which is that, the technology and the sophistication of AI and content management in different languages is really under-resourced, aside from, let's say, the top 20 languages around the globe. And that's an incredible problem, because less than 10% of Facebook users are in the US, right? And we think about how many individuals across the country that speak not the top 20 languages are using Facebook without real and resourced and sophisticated AI to be able to, manage the content and better understand what's going on. So they absolutely have the resources to do it. It's whether they have the will, and we know the problem is there.
So I think maybe I just want to round it up by putting it in a very simple, maybe definition. So what do you call it when you send out, like, let me say, when you send out a product or an entity, it extracts money from that entity, which is outside of that country, causes damage, right? And you don't give a damn about that damage, and then you take all the money back to your home country. What is that called?
Colonialization.
It's called colonialism. That's what it is. So, this is essentially what we talk about, especially. This is literally the definition of what digital colonialism is. And that is the kind of effects that it has. Yeah.
Thank you all so much for that. And I just want to plug again to the audience, please think up some good questions and drop them into the chat. And Spandy, I want to move to you here because most major platforms already say they value transparency. I recently worked in the Senate and heard that from Facebook more times than I can count. But could you describe a little bit around how those transparency efforts have fallen short, and how specifically the platforms could be more transparent?
Definitely. Thanks, Rishi. And I also just wanted to tack on to the last point that everyone was making, that we also see digital colonialism appear in the way that many people do advocacy and think about tech policy. When we think about how do we rein platforms in and protect users, many policymakers also focus on users in the United States. They focus on users in these majority markets. They're not thinking about how are we extending these protections to people in other countries. On the transparency point, so I think when it comes to platform uses of AI for moderation and curation, there are 3 concrete areas where we really lack transparency, and where I think more insight would particularly benefit civil society, researchers, and lawmakers. The first area is we lack transparency around the concrete policies that platforms use to guide how they are deploying these automated tools. So, over the past few years, like I mentioned in my intro remarks, we've seen platforms expand how they're tackling misinformation, disinformation, to just beyond removing the content. So now we see platforms are downranking this content. They're intervening in recommendations that are generated by algorithms. They're labeling the content. but we know very little about the policies that guide when platforms are using these algorithmic interventions. And over the past few weeks, actually, we've seen some increased transparency in this regard. So Facebook, for example, recently released these content distribution guidelines, which provide some insight into what kind of content they algorithmically downrank and why. And this does touch on misinformation, but the policies are not really granular enough to understand clear definitions and how these policies are applied in practice. The second area where I think we need more transparency is when it comes to the impact of algorithmic interventions. So, right now, many platforms publish transparency reports, like Lauren mentioned, which outline the scope and scale of their content moderation efforts. But there's very little information in there about the role that automated tools play. Similarly, especially in the misinformation and disinformation context, platforms often say, we're doing a great job. We downranked this much content. We labeled this many posts. We did, here's a nice number. But they don't really tell us what impact did this have on the overall state of misinformation and disinformation on the platform. You labeled posts. Did people actually, or you added a link to, authoritative source and people actually click it? What actual tangible impact have your efforts had on misleading information online? And I think without this kind of impact data, companies are essentially asking us to trust that their approaches work with providing evidence. And right now there's a massive trust deficit between companies and the public. And so this data is really important for filling in that gap. And then lastly, I think we lack transparency around how these various automated tools are trained and developed. And I think this is an area that's a little more challenging because, we're trying to understand what is meaningful data in this context and what kind of data can we obtain to produce viable and useful accountability, and not just have transparency for the sake of transparency. So I think there's definitely a lot more thinking to be done on the part of civil society, lawmakers, and advocates as to what data points we want from platforms. But it's also important that platforms are doing this thinking proactively as well.
Yeah, and these improved transparency measures, are these things you think the platforms can or will do themselves, or do you think legislation is required?
Yeah, so I think historically, civil society and lawmakers have pushed platforms to proactively provide transparency around their operations. So for example, a few years ago, we as civil society, we as the public, we knew very little about how platforms were moderating content on their services. And thanks to sustained pressure and key guidance from civil society organizations and advocates on what meaningful transparency in this area looks like, companies began releasing this data voluntarily. But we've seen that not all companies have joined in on this effort. And we've also seen that many companies that do issue data and information on their content moderation, they report, vastly different statistics, or they use vastly different definitions. And so that can make that's helpful in the context of understanding how content moderation occurs differently on different services. But it also does make it challenging to compare and contrast the efforts of different platforms. But I think, now where we are today, like I mentioned, there's a significant trust deficit between companies and the public. And so we're seeing that there's more legislation pushing for platforms to be transparent, because I think the consensus is that in specific areas like misinformation, disinformation, online hate, the use of AI and ML, companies have not done enough to demonstrate accountability. And so there needs to be a more concrete push to mandate this kind of transparency from them. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about these mandates and how they can be most effective. Some companies are particularly reticent to share information. They claim that sharing too much information can violate trade secrets. It can help bad actors game them, that transparency is expensive. And that is definitely true, especially for smaller platforms. But in order for mandates for transparency to be really impactful, I think it's important to tackle three key things. The first is we need clear definitions. So we've seen a lot of proposed legislation out there, for example, saying we want platforms to tell us how much content they algorithmically amplify or de-amplify. But how do you define amplify? A platform, product manager might define this differently than a lawmaker would. And so if we want to obtain meaningful transparency, we need clear definitions around key terms like this. Second, in terms of meaningful data points, I think there needs to be broader multi-stakeholder conversations around why we want certain data points and what objectives they're achieving. And I think for a period, it seemed like we were pushing for transparency for the sake of transparency. But now that we have, lawmakers interested in this, and we have the sort of public push to actually be able to achieve this, we really need to think critically about what do we want the most, what are our key priorities, and how will this help us generate accountability. And I think both of these ideas of meaningful transparency and definitions are also very important for promoting technical alignment from a platform perspective and ensuring that they're collecting the right data, establishing the right structures to collect that data, and that the policy and sort of technical conversations are meeting in the middle.
Thank you so much.
I just wanted to add that, I think that we've seen, let alone that, companies can't be trusted to be accountable or transparent without some kind of intervention from policymakers or advocacy from communities, right? And, especially when we think about the firing of Timnit Gebru, among other kinds of things that have come up in the recent trial with the kind of information that they held internally about harmful things that are happening to different people in our community. And so the factor is, I think that there's a large role for policymakers to play in federal government in trying to, develop laws to ensure that we can hold these accountable and ensure that we get the information that we need to protect people all over the world. And so it may not be enough for companies just to create their kind of internal content moderation policies and such like that, but that we need to have outside entities that are actually doing audits and reviewing the kinds of actions and practices that these companies are developing.
And just to quickly jump in there as well, I think that the theme of trust and distrust that both Spandy and Dominique brought up is incredibly true. And when we think about transparency and voluntary transparency, I think a couple of key factors that are missing are what are the exceptions to the rules? Because what we're finding more and more is that whether we're seeing transparency from policies and enforcement, we don't know about a lot of the exceptions that are taking place. Like we learned about the cross-check program of Facebook, and that a lot of VIPs and politicians aren't being fed through the typical content management streamline. And then the last piece is when platforms are given license to engage in their own voluntary transparency, it's easy to pick data points that create a narrative or a framework, as opposed to having consistent and third-party metrics to measure against. So you can pick a numerator that's great and not show the denominator, and then you can put out a great statistic that says we're doing a great job, we're taking down X%. Well, again, if you don't know both sides to the equation, then what are we really learning from that?
Thanks so much. That's going to wrap up the panel portion here. And we're going to start taking questions from the audience. We've got a great one here to start. And I'll just pitch this to the crew, and folks can jump in as they'd like. Do you see accelerationism as a new version of social Darwinism? And if so, what social belief, metaphor should be promoted to replace it? It's a very good question.
Yeah, it's definitely getting us all thinking. I do think that to an extent, and I'll start, it won't be complete, and I encourage my colleagues here to jump in. I do think that acceleration can be considered a new form of social Darwinism, but I do have to say, like, the amount of influence that that has put forward accelerationism as this sort of new world coming from platforms in and of themselves, can't be ignored. What should be promoted to replace it? I think that it's really important to understand that acceleration isn't always the model to move forward with, right? We know that big tech platforms started with the phrase "move fast, break things," right? And now look where we are. So while I do think it's a natural tendency, we don't always have to give into those tendencies completely and chalk it up to a change in the environment. I think we can think through a more of a balanced approach to, yes, we want to move forward and we want to move forward quickly. We want to look at the holistic impact of what we're doing and what we're valuing. I'll turn it over to others though.
Yeah, I can jump in, and I think that framing of accelerationism as a new version of social Darwinism is interesting, but I would interrogate a little bit to ask whose acceleration, because I don't think that the technological advancements that we've seen over the last 2 decades have, equally accelerated the rights and opportunities of everybody. And so I think that if we're trying to replace it with a belief, it's probably, maybe a more equitable acceleration, or perhaps like Lauren was mentioning, with that whole move fast and break things approach, things are broken now. So, maybe we need to take a moment and think instead about how are we repairing the things that have been broken, and how are we ensuring that these kinds of safety mechanisms, safety by design, equity by design, are being embedded from the beginning for new products, and how are old products sort of being changed to reflect these new values.
And just to quickly chime back in, I think, Spanny, you bring up a great point. When we think about accelerationism, who's in the front and how did they get there, right? So if we really are thinking about something to replace it, it should be thinking about equity by design, anti-hate by design, privacy by design, safety by design, because accelerationism often overlooks some of those really important factors.
Great. Thanks for tackling that one. It's a toughie. The next question here comes from an audience member named Aurora. Thanks, Aurora, for the questions. What solutions do you think there are to address this clear conflict of interest? And the conflict of interest that Aurora is referring to is that these platforms benefit through the form of significant revenue from disinformation. And so why should we trust them to address it when to say it plainly, that's their cash cow?
I think I can answer that. I think there's this sort of budding idea that, social media platforms can learn a lot by simply looking at the banking industry in terms of some of the standards that they've actually placed. Because, when you think about the idea that social
Every time that happens, I'm so sure that big tech knows what we're up to and they're pulling the plug on us. Odenga, you're back. Sorry. All good.
Yes, so I was saying, can you hear me? Sorry, just confirm.
We can hear you.
Yes, so what I was saying is we could learn a lot from the banking industry because they have been in a similar position before, where they have found themselves facilitating and profiting off of a lot of bad behavior. And what has happened is that they have found certain processes that allow them to, of course, sort of engineer safety into the systems that they create. So one of them, for example, is know your customer, know your customer principles, right? There are too many cases whereby big tech companies are profiting by simply being neglectful of the kind of people that are purchasing ads on their platform, right? That's one very simple fix that, perhaps can actually go a very long way in keeping them from taking money from bad actors, such as human traffickers, hate speech purveyors and all that kind of stuff, right? Working on that and basically slowing down and is going to drastically change how they do business with such kind of people. It's not to say that it's an ultimate fix, but definitely there. And then algorithmic governance, right? At the same time, there are certain rules that banks also have in terms of how they're allowed to operate, right? And, there are very many times where even, okay, for me as an African, it's a very uncomfortable idea, but there are many cases where government officers sit in banks to ensure that they're actually doing their job properly. So, are there other industries that we can learn from? Probably those are the big questions, because a lot of these problems that we're facing with social media are actually not necessarily new. Yes.
Thanks for taking that one. Here we've got the last question, I think, before we wrap up, and it's right there at the bottom. It seems like there are calls for increased transparency across the board, but what are the obstacles? Who's opposed and why?
I'm happy to just jump in there and plug a little bit of what I said before, which is that companies will claim there are trade secrets that folks can game their systems. Whether or not those claims are entirely accurate, I think needs to be interrogated as like a means for promoting transparency. And then I think as we now enter this moment where we have so many stakeholders that are now interested in promoting transparency, really defining meaningful transparency and setting clear objectives for the transparency is also incredibly important. And then specifically in the algorithmic governance space also, I would highlight that we hear a lot of lawmakers and civil society push for things like algorithmic audits and impact assessments from platforms, but we're missing an intermediate step there, which is that we don't have clear frameworks for these assessments. And so if I were to go and conduct an audit and then Lauren was to go conduct an audit on her own, are the methodologies the same? Are they comparable? What are we auditing? Who's auditing? Is it reliable? I think these are all questions that need to be answered in the interim before we can have laws that require companies to subject to these kinds of assessments.
And what I would say in terms of the argument around trade secrets, it's that, companies hire external law firms to address, some internal issues that they may face. So if it means hiring an external entity or third-party organization to manage that information, right, and provide public with enough data or insights so that we know what the result of some audit was, then that's the way to go. But to simply say that you don't want to share your secrets and you're afraid that, some other company will pick up kind of the things that the idea that you've created, I think is a weak argument, because there are other ways in order to have someone else evaluate your systems, policies, and programs in a way that's safe for you as a company and a business, but in a way that is morally good for communities and people. And so I think that companies need to think more in that lane, is, whether it is coming together, funding, I don't know, some kind of external entity, or, the federal government helping and creating some kind of entity that is able to have that information and data and are able to evaluate it. And just like Odenga said, it's being done in industries like banking and such like that. So how can we use those kind of structures in order to create spaces that can fulfill these needs of these kind of transparency reports and audits?
And I think that Spandy and Dominique really brought up that there might be obstacles, but they are certainly, we can overcome them, absolutely. So any obstacle really, whether it's developing frameworks or definitions, finding the right third party, finding the level of abstraction where we can learn, but trade secrets aren't, being divulged, it's very doable. It's just the will to do it. And I'm hoping that we're at the moment where we can.
Great. Thanks so much, Lauren. Any final thoughts here from our panelists? Okay. Well, first, want to thank everyone in the audience for joining us. This was such a fun event to prepare for. I hope everyone had as much fun as we did here on the panel. And thanks a ton to our panelists. You all are brilliant and made my job very easy. So thanks a ton, and hope to connect with you all soon. For those in the audience, our names and organizations here are underneath our faces on your screen. Feel free to reach out and follow up with any questions. We'd love to connect with you. Thanks for joining us.